And the final session is titled Changing the Game. So we're going to hear all about innovation and how to find and grow the new disruptors. And also, I'd like to mention a final time today, please interact with the different speakers that we have lined up for you in this session via the Slido app. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure to introduce to you the moderator of this session, Johnny Voon, Innovation Lead Digital at Innovate UK.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm hoping you're having a fantastic day so far. I know I am. And we've got a fantastic session, a fantastic final last session here. We've got 5 speakers who are at the top of their game when it comes to disruption, who are going to tell you about who are the next disruptors, who are going to tell you where these disruptions are coming from, and they're going to give you some really raw and brutal insights from their experience. But first, to kick this all off, I'd like to introduce to the stage Mike Moore, who's a senior principal from Accenture Research, to give us a little bit of a background about what they've been doing. So please welcome to the stage, Mike.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks very much for the introduction, Johnny. As Johnny was saying, my name's Mike Moore, and I'm a senior principal at Accenture Research, where I'm responsible for our Chief Strategy Officer's research agenda. The CSO at Accenture sets the future direction of the company. He determines what new assets we should be developing for our clients. And in support of that, he's also responsible for all of our organic and inorganic investments. And so for him, the topic of disruption is an important one, both in terms of understanding how we as a business may be disrupted by new emerging players, but also how our clients may be. And what we find when we speak to our clients is that the vast majority of them do believe that over the course of the next few years, they will be disrupted. But perhaps disconcertingly, the vast majority of them aren't necessarily prepared. So when we surveyed CSOs from a number of different geographies and industries, just 20% said that they felt they were. And part of the reason we thought there was a disconnect there is because whilst there's a lot of qualitative discussion, panel discussion about disruption, disruptive innovation, disruptive technologies, there's not necessarily a very robust quantitative fact base for executives to draw on to better understand where disruption might be coming from. So, with that in mind, we built what we called the Disruptability Index. So this is a quantitative tool that at the top level is designed to do 2 things. Firstly, to understand the current level of disruption across different industries, and we look at 106 in total, and then also to understand the susceptibility to future disruption of those industries as well. To understand the current level of disruption, what we do is follow the money from incumbents and looking at any declines in revenue and profitability, and then to disruptors, so looking, for example, at levels of venture capital across different industries. And then to understand the susceptibility to future disruption, we look at fault lines across 3 core dimensions: efficiency, innovation, and defenses. In essence, what we ask is it possible for a disruptor, a new emerging company, to come along and be more efficient, be more innovative than the existing players in an industry, and also to break down the defenses and barriers to entry within that industry? So what did we find? Well, first of all, the hyperbole that we see in the headlines about disruption is not without merit. Over the course of the time period that we looked at from 2011 to 2018, there has been an increase in the scale, speed, and impact of disruption. So over the course of the last few years, there's obviously been a big ramp up in venture capital spend, partially due to low interest rates, but also because investors are looking for new sources of return. Companies are looking for new sources of ideas. And as a consequence of that, we've seen the accelerated emergence of very large startups, so-called unicorns, which are being born at a faster rate than they were previously. And ultimately, what all that has driven is increased disruption in almost all of the industry sectors that we looked at today in comparison to the start of the decade. Now, in terms of the nature of the disruption in different industries, if we just pick one example, the fast-moving consumer goods industry, what we've seen over the course of the past few years is the emergence of a lot of direct-to-consumer companies who are responsible for producing, selling, and marketing their products directly to customers. And they now serve a vast variety of niche markets, covering everything from Ease, which delivers cannabis to customers in a number of markets in the US, to Hims, which provides products for men to tackle issues that they're normally too embarrassed to talk about. And what's promoted the accelerated emergence of these companies is the fact that they're now able to, in essence, rent the benefits of scale that were previously the preserve of large incumbent companies. So they can use Instagram for their marketing, AWS for their compute, they can use Shopify for their fulfillment. And that means today, even individuals can build billion-dollar brands. Take Kylie Jenner. Kylie Jenner's Kylie Cosmetics started in 2015, has just 7 employees, and last year had revenues in excess of $300 million. So even the C-suite today is concerned with keeping up with the Kardashians. But what's concerning for the C-suite is that the nature of the disruptive threat is now evolving. So over the course of much of the past decade, what startups were focused on doing is, in essence, overlaying digital technologies on top of the physical world. Whereas now what we're increasingly seeing is startups that are using disruptive technologies to change the very fundamentals of the physical world. So over the course of the past few years, we've had platforms like WeChat and Snap that enable us to build and edit our virtual selves. Whereas perhaps in the future, as a consequence of a combination of disruptive technologies like AI, robotics, CRISPR, we may be able to edit our physical selves, or at least build systems that enable us to complete physical tasks. And then equally, if you look at the transportation sector, over the course of the past few years, again, you've had companies like Uber and Didi that have used technologies like mobile, cloud computing, and analytics to better connect us to existing transportation systems. Whereas now you have companies like Hyperloop One and Kitty Hawk that are building entirely new forms of transportation system. So the question we're here to talk about today is who will be the next disruptors? And the last slide perhaps points to some of them, but also which industries will be disrupted next. And the slide that I'm showing on the screen shows some of the results from the index. So on one of the axes, the current level of disruption, so as you go higher, industries are more disrupted. And then on the other axis, susceptibility to future disruption. So as you move to the right, industries are more exposed potentially in the future. And the industries that are perhaps most at risk, or should be the most concerned, are those that are in the bottom right quadrant. So these are companies that haven't necessarily experienced a great deal of disruption yet, at least in relative terms, but are highly susceptible. So including the likes of textiles, construction materials, and home building. But perhaps also worryingly for me, research and consulting services. So with that, it's time to disrupt myself and get the rest of the panel on the stage.
Great. Thank you very much, Michael. Round of applause, please, for that very insight. So I'd like to invite the rest of the panel up, if you wouldn't mind coming up. And as they will, I'll just give you just a very brief introduction. So we have Dr. Louise Maynard-Atem, the innovation lead from the Data Exchange team from Experian. We have Jason Myers, who's the Chief Executive Officer for Next Gen Manufacturing in Canada. We've got Bindi Kadia from Bindi Ventures. We have Jean-David Malo, the Director of Open Innovation and Open Science for the European Commission. So folks, the way I like to run my panels is very dynamic, and I like to question them, and I want you to do the same as well too. No question is too difficult. No topic is off the table. I want you to challenge our panelists, because We want to inspire you. Okay, you guys are the future. You guys are here to learn from us. We want to inspire you. So to do that, you need to challenge us. So firstly, so Mike, you've given us a bit of an introduction as well. As we go through, I'd like you to quickly talk about what you do in your company very briefly, and any insights, any points of agreement or disagreement from Mike's presentation that you might have. So Louise.
Yeah, sure. So I'm Louise Maynard-Attam. I sit in the newly formed data innovation team in Experian. We started about July of last year, and our focus is very much on understanding how data is going to shape the products and services that we need to provide over the sort of 5 to 10 years. So we don't really focus so much on the technology itself, but rather the data that's coming out of a lot of these new technologies and how we can harness that and how we can drive value from that for ourselves, but also how we can drive value for the subjects of that data, so generally the consumers. So we think that the data, my data belongs to me, your data belongs to you, and that is the way we think the world is going to move. So we need to understand, okay, what is our role in that new world, and how do we help facilitate those things to happen? And I guess what I found really interesting about your presentation, Mike, was on the very first slide. So it said 20% of organizations feel that they are ready, and I'd probably argue and say that it's less than that. So that's 1 in 5 organizations think they're ready for the disruptive innovation. And I've worked in a number of large corporates, and I would say it's probably less than 1 in 5.
Is that just misplaced optimism?
I think it might be. I think it's a sense of, oh, I think I'm better at something than I actually am, and the way that humans just default to over-assuming their own capabilities, perhaps, because I think a lot of organizations absolutely will pay lip service to innovation. It's exactly what they say they want to do. They've got to keep their shareholders happy. But when it comes to actually doing it, actually on the ground, actually taking innovations and making them part of business as usual, that is ridiculously hard. I'm not saying Experian have mastered it. I'm not saying other organizations have mastered it. So I'd say that of that 20%, I'd argue that it's probably lower than 1 in 5.
So the danger here is that while that could be very true, that could also point to the fact that CEOs just don't understand where their companies really are. And so, Jason, you're a CEO, okay? I'm not pointing that you don't.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
But in your experience, are those numbers about right? Do you feel like you have the pulse of your organization when it comes to disruption?
So I run the Advanced Manufacturing Supercluster in Canada, and our organization is called Next Generation Manufacturing Canada. So it's all about disruption. It's all about trying to combine the strengths of technology with our strengths in research, with our strengths in manufacturing. A lot easier said than done, and I totally agree. We conducted a survey about 6,000 manufacturing and technology companies in both Canada and the United States. 7% of manufacturers, mainly small companies in both countries, do any competitive benchmarking. So 93% are working in the dark. Now that's better than the technology side, because only 5% of technology companies in North America do any competitive benchmarking. So, I couldn't agree more. I think one of the marks of a successful company is to be able to develop a strategy, develop management processes that can effectively integrate the innovation and disruptive technologies in their own business. And in order to do that, you really need to take a look at how you add value to your customer.
And Bindi, actually, this is a great segue to you, because you're an advisor, you've been on a number of councils and an investor yourself. How important is this external role that other people can bring in? So, speaking to Jason and his companies, is having these external advisors important to help someone like Jason and other people understand really where their competitors are? Or is it just a glory role of having an industrial advisory board and a series of advisors to sit there?
That's definitely not the case. I've got to justify my existence. Sort of by way of background, I've had the fortune of working, I guess, across 4 pillars, and that's why I found your presentation really fascinating. So I have worked in corporate, and my role in corporate was to be an internal troublemaker, bring in the startups, and get our product teams at Microsoft to understand how startups are using and breaking the technology. I'm currently advising a very large growth stage VC fund, and I'm spending a lot of time, it's not just deal sourcing. It's also about understanding what the corporates are thinking and working out what the startups are doing. Third pillar, I spend time with government and government policy, and Jean-David will talk about this, but I actually sat on the European Innovation Council, and they brought in external experts like myself to really cause trouble. I think we did cause a lot of trouble in the room, didn't we, in Brussels? But really, our job was to really question and challenge how they viewed innovation. And then the fourth pillar in terms of corporates, even though I worked in a corporate, my observation is more and more corporates are setting up digital advisory boards, and actually it's CEO and top exec level that are running those boards. So I sat on Shop Direct Digital Board for 3 years, and that term ended last year. And the CEO was at the majority of those meetings, and they really did listen to our challenges as they were trying to switch from becoming a catalog business to a purely online business. And Shop Direct is one of the largest e-commerce retailers in the UK, second behind just Amazon. I've just recently joined Centrica Digital Board, and the same thing. We are talking to the top execs. So the 20% number, I think more and more corporates are realizing they have to be open to listening to external feedback, and they're bringing in people like me to help with that external feedback. But then actually the real view for success, in my point of view, will be, can you land it in the business units? Can you get the people on the ground thinking that way innovatively, while still maintaining integrity to what the shareholder demands are, which are much more short-term? So I think it's that tension that you've got to really think about between corporate, startup, investor, and government bodies.
And I think, a very good segue to the government as well, too. If we look at, this feedback, now we mentioned the European Investment Council and Innovation Council. Is that high-level investment, Jean-David, is that too big? Will businesses listen in the sense now, or is that too little, too late? The European Council, open to influence from corporates and others?
So first of all, it's never too late, and I would like to insist on this. Let's be very frank. And it was not mentioned per se in the slides that, by the way, were fascinating, mentioned by Mike, but it appears in one of the slides. We lost the first battle in Europe. Especially in the digital world and everything which is relating to digital technology, Internet of Things, and all of this. Let's be clear, the GAFAM are American, the BAT are Chinese, and it's just a fact. We can continue to cry on it, it will not change the world. Having said that, and the reason why we worked with experts such as Bindi, but also some large corporates as well as some scientists in the recent years, is that we believe that disruptive innovation is certainly one of the avenues on which we can restore the competitiveness of Europe. Even if we lost the first battle, we do believe that the next wave of innovation will be based on deep tech. And there we have a number of strengths in Europe. But it's not because we have a number of strengths that we are ready to build on these strengths. We have in Europe a very paradoxical situation. We are certainly among the best, if not the best, in our capacity to generate knowledge. You can see it in the level of high-quality publication on our researcher side. You can see it in the number of laureates in the Nobel Prize and in any kind of awards of this kind. But we remain, I will not be politically correct, but incapable to transfer this knowledge into innovation. And it's very interesting because when you look, for example, at the number of startups, because disruption is coming from startups, generated in Europe, we are generating yearly more startups than the US.
So then why then as the US, do startups want to go to the US? Why then is investment seen as US? Is that a perception?
No, you have a number of reasons. First, it's not because we are more stupid than the American. We are convinced that we are not.
Americans.
First, we remain with a fragmented market. Let's be clear. We have not a single market yet in Europe. We have still 28, unfortunately 27, different markets, which hamper the fluidity of the exchange within Europe, and in particular the market penetration for some companies. Second, we have still, despite the fact that the venture capital fundraising increased, we have still a very fragmented but also a very small venture capital market in Europe, and which remains very risky. And which is working also in silos. I mean, if you're a startup today, your daily life is you knock at the door of a pre-seed fund. Then if you are lucky, you have to knock on the door of a seed fund. If you are lucky, you have to knock at the door of an early stage fund. Then if you are lucky, and this is your daily life.
Okay, so let's go to Bindi. I want to ask this.
You have not this situation in the US.
But, so Bindi, is that what you see? Is that true? Is that...
Well, I want to quote, I was in Silicon Valley last November with the venture fund that I'm at as an advisor, and there's this amazing speaker called Kai-Fu Lee, and he leads a big venture fund in China. He was the head of Microsoft Research in China, also ran Google in China, and there was a chart that came out before Christmas, and I know you remember this one, where the top 25 valued internet companies globally were either American or Chinese. And the question came out, like, why is it just the Americans and the Chinese? And I think Kai-Fu Lee gave one of the best answers, and I think this is something we need to think about in Europe. Number one, he said the Chinese are gladiators. And what that means is there might be 500 companies solving the same problem, but one will win. Hence there's an Alibaba, hence there's a Tencent. That's the first thing. Americans are innovators and see an issue and a problem, and they'll get out there and they'll build the largest companies in the world. So Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft, right? That's the case. In Europe, it's less of an attitude to risks that we have. We're much more risk averse. And if you look at the way venture is, as a final comment, is I would say venture in London, even though it's massive, and Tech Nation just released their report today, so I do encourage you to download that. But actually, we are probably, in terms of size of funds, where Silicon Valley was at in 2000, 2001. Yeah. So we're really far behind, but we're actually on the same kind of capacity for growth. So the VC fund that I'm working with, we see that longer term, as long as we carry on the same growth trajectory, we'll probably have companies like that in the next 10, 15 years.
So Mike, I mean, does the data back that up? Is that what you see with the data, or is that different? I mean, your experiences with that?
I mean, I think if you just look at the UK, there are real pockets of strength. So where we have a core set of capabilities, particularly in the financial services sector, then startups are able to attract significant capital, both locally from overseas players. And that's really just a question of, we have a certain level of expertise that we can draw on that attracts companies to come here, like TransferWise. But then also we've seen WhatsApp recently announcing that their payments technology will be developed in the UK. And that's to draw on the talent that we have. But they also talked about the fact that London has a great deal of cognitive diversity, and that will help them serve multiple markets. So I think it's a question of reflecting on the UK and Europe's strengths and how we can build on those.
So Jason, being from Canada, obviously, your nearest partner makes sense to be the US, right? And I guess your biggest market is first the US. Where do you see the rest of the world? Is China the next big opportunity? Or are places like Europe and the UK nice for their cognitive diversity, but reality is market-wise too difficult, too slow? I mean, your brutal thoughts on that, because we need to hear if it's wrong.
I think it's really difficult to look at Europe as a whole. I think you have very different cultures of innovation and commercial development, business development in the UK, in Germany and France, from Denmark, from the Netherlands, Belgium. Much more, in my view, much more open to international partnerships, much more open to innovation. There, and I would, in a way, say that's where Canada, a lot of this conversation is very, very familiar to me because we talk about this as well, and being risk averse and too small. And some of the most innovative companies that I know basically have to be innovative. They have to export simply because in Canada they're so far away from each other. Saskatchewan, in Western Canada, as you know, is
6-hour flight.
It's a 6-hour flight, and that's just across the province. But companies are located disparately across the province. Very difficult to work together. Yet some of the most innovative companies that I know of, simply because they have to. And so in Canada, we've been in a free trade arrangement with the United States. Not an easy game these days either. But we've been in a free trade arrangement with the United States for approximately 30 years. And of course, everybody was very worried that this is going to be the end of Canadian industry, and in many cases, the Americans made it very difficult for Canadian companies to compete. But if you do a financial comparison on average, and Canadian manufacturing and U.S. manufacturing, Canadian companies are much more profitable on average than American companies are, because they're smaller, they're more agile, they're more innovative. The problem is, how do we scale? And that is an issue, and I think we face a number of the same financing problems, the same issues around risk aversion, structural issues, as many as is the case here. But I think there's a tremendous opportunity today with new technology to provide that scale, those opportunities of scale. And that, to us, is where the...
Okay, so that's a very good segue, because I was going to ask about technology. We have a question about technology and the impact of whether technology is about technology or about the impact. And a lot of times people do go, well, you know, if you want disruption, you just choose your next buzzword. You choose AI, 5G, blockchain, all those sort of things, and they're just passing trends. But manufacturing in particular, because manufacturing has gone through, has had this history of being the first to adopt technologies, you know, the first generation, the first revolution, steam, electricity, you know, and digital and so forth. But technology, you know, has had a huge impact into manufacturing. But is technology the savior of manufacturing, or is it other things? You mentioned scale, you mentioned funding. I mean, you know, when we look at it, I really want to also focus on people as well, too, because we've talked about technology, about business models, but ultimately, the people that run this, the CEOs, the advisors, the policymakers, are the ones that help shape that. Does anyone have any thoughts on people and how the role of people? Yeah, Bindi.
I want to just state one statistic, because it was just released in this Tech Nation report, and then I'll sort of segue to manufacturing, because there's a really interesting report that came out from Siemens about 1.5 years ago, Siemens UK. So it said the recent growth rate, and I'm sorry, I know we're not in London, I know this is London-centric number, but so I apologize for that. But it said the recent growth rate for London tech scale-ups at 56% makes the cluster first in the world for scale-up growth as of now, which I thought was very interesting. And you know, there'll be similar levels of growth in different parts of the country. I would say Manchester, Edinburgh, you know, Bristol, clusters like that. But in terms of manufacturing, I think it's around the technologies that are coming into place, such as robotics or artificial intelligence, or manufacturing 4.0, will require a different skill set in the people. And so actually, the Siemens UK report that came out in conjunction with the UK government, it said something like 150,000 plus jobs, net new, would be created in the UK in the manufacturing sector. And a lot of that was down to, you know, the technology innovations and advances. But the thing to call out is people need to be reskilled into those new levels. So for example, robotics, you need someone to be able to run the army of robots on the assembly line. With the AI, you need a level of human oversight into the AI, which will spit out maybe the very generic answers, but you need the smart human to really then create some value add to the insights that are being spit out through those engines.
So this is something that's been promised.
It's a new skill set that we really need to think about.
Yeah, this has been something that's been promised, and the social aspect. So, you know, people cheered when Amazon said, we're doing all these fulfillment centers, new jobs, everything else, it's fantastic. But then there are complaints saying actually the work conditions weren't great, and now that they're being replaced by robots that they're trialing. So when we look at the social impact of disruption, which we forget about, when we look at the technology, we look at the economic, there's a social side of it. And Louise, when we look at it from a data science, an individual point of view, what is the impact, the social impact that people have, especially when it comes to things like so experience a lot about sort of credit rating, and people look at employment and so forth, and their data points. Is the disruption that a big player like an Amazon or an Uber or the gig economy bringing through, is that having an impact on the way that people think about themselves, their relation to society, their relation to other people, for example?
I think it is, and I guess for me the ultimate impact of disruption is that it has the potential to change people's way of thinking and their behaviors. So yes, the technology absolutely enables disruption to happen, but the measure of it is like the conversation we were having earlier. Now, I never go to a supermarket anymore because my groceries get delivered to my door, but I still want to try and address in store. I think it's a case of that change in behavior. That is how disruption manifests in a lot of people. And I think the upskilling point is absolutely something that we at Experian think about quite a lot, because, yes, jobs are going to be created, but there are going to be jobs that are lost. And so, yes, there will be net new jobs, but we need to balance that off with the fact that people are going to be losing jobs to automation. So there isn't, as far as I can see, a concerted effort to try and actually upskill people in the light of this disruption. And I think that's something we absolutely need to think about and try and implement. Because yes, we know that it's coming, and we know that people are going to need to harness their more creative type skills or maybe more STEM type skills. But there's no concerted effort, as far as I'm aware, to actually start to upskill people now.
And so to Jean-David, is the European Innovation Council, are they looking at reducing job losses? Is that a role of the Innovation Council?
Not a first objective, I would say.
Okay.
This is not the objective per se. This is one of the expected impacts that we have in mind ultimately, because by definition, if you are changing from a market to another, the first thing that is happening is the destruction of the first market. So you have to take this into account. Having said that, it will not be the first time in history. It's not the first disruption. Yeah. The car industry, when it emerged, has created a disruption. When electricity emerged, it has created a disruption. So it's not the first time that this kind of things happen. So we should be very careful in the fear that are generated here and there, sometimes in a non-controlled way. I just would like to add something which is not necessarily linked to the social impact, but more to the societal impact. Because what is at stake also here is also the vision of the society that we have. We are 2 weeks before European elections. It's not because I'm working in the Commission that I'm just saying this, but just we have to always keep this in mind. We have a particular model in Europe. It's not the model of North America in terms of society. It's not the model of China. But one thing for sure, if we have not, in a number of sectors, a number of industries that are leading in Europe, our model will potentially disappear. And our model is very particular. It's a model which is based on social values, on more and more now the sustainable development and the environmental friendly approach, which is based on capitalism and things like this. It's a particular model, and this is a model that we built over the last 70 years. So what is at stake here also is not only a question of technology, jobs, and things like this, it's also the way we live in our society. And it's absolutely necessary that not only the private sector is taking this in charge, but also the public sector. The rationale behind the EIC, and we discussed it also extensively with Bindi and the other members of the EIC high-level group, is behind the vision that we have. What is the purpose of what we are doing? What kind of society do we want tomorrow for our children? And there, it's not only the beauty of a new technology that can change the life of people, it's how it will impact the way we live. And if we want to influence this, we must be leaders. If we are followers, We will just be followers.
So this is, I mean, someone has put a question up around, let's talk about unicorns, and why not about zebras, which is the first time I've heard about that. Thank you very much for enlightening me, which are companies that are both profitable and improving society. Is that sort of what you're alluding to? You want to find the zebras, not the unicorns. Is that a key thing? I mean,
I will not judge one company in front of another. It's not the purpose. But I mean, let's take an example. Within the disruptive technologies that will emerge, some of them can play a key role in the objectives that we have regarding climate change. Let's be clear. You mentioned rightly, Jason, that one of the main difficulties that we are facing when you are coming with a potentially disruptive technology or breakthrough market-creating innovation is that you have difficulties to find the means for your scale-up. Let's be honest again. Don't expect the private sector to do it alone, because of the particularity of our own landscape in terms of venture capital, the size, as it was mentioned rightly by Bindi a few seconds ago, the diversification of the portfolio of VC funds do not allow this kind of risk-taking. So the only way to proceed is to ask the public sector to substitute and to accompany this together with the private sector, to do it in a partnership. And this is the whole rationale of the European Innovation Council that we are just launching today. For the first time ever in history, we will take the risk on the side of the public administration in order to attract the private sector subsequently, or to come together in the scaling up of a promising startup. In particular, in areas that were rightly mentioned in the last slide of Mike, but also in a bottom-up approach. Because, allow me just a last word on this, John. You can predict some areas because you have some first element of proof. But 10 years ago, will you be able to predict what will be the next disruption? No. So you cannot only go with a top-down approach and focusing, of course, on artificial intelligence, quantum, robotics, and so on, for sure. But you have also to give the possibility for very radical new ideas coming from anywhere to emerge.
Okay, so on that prediction, and Mike, the comment about the role of public sector investment, did the data show anything about that? Are there any clear predictions that came through? And was there anything that sort of surprised you? I mean, as the report author.
Well, I think I'd highlight, first of all, that in no way do we say that the index has any form of predictive power. If it did, I wouldn't be on the stage. I think I'd be in the Caribbean. Okay. But I think, and someone asked the question before about, is it about technology or impacts? What we need to get companies to do is not focused on the technologies that they can put into the marketplace, but rather the problems that they can solve.
Sure.
And we need companies to act in a more responsible way about how they use technology. One of the things Accenture has actually done is we've started a responsible business council, which has representatives from the very top of senior leadership, who so we're not just talking about the amount of money that we make or how we grow or scale certain parts of our business, but how we actually act as a responsible corporate citizen. And also, whenever we do a project, we always go into it with that in mind.
Is that just, forgive me being skeptical, is that not just lip service? Because ultimately, people want to be profitable and still make money, and if you had to choose.
Yeah, I think it depends on who's financing the business, right? So sitting in the deal room in a VC, we're talking about returns. When are we going to get our money back? How many X times are we going to return it? Because we've got LPs, people who fund the VC fund, to answer to, because they want a return, right? So that's, in that case, government, and Jean-David, I know you can answer better to this, government might be financing this because they do want to have wealth creation, job creation, economic growth, and actually folks like the EU and certainly UK government have identified technology as one of those sectors that can create that. Corporates are looking for innovations to please the shareholders and continue to have them grow and change with a lot of the external forces in their way. So it's more strategic. And startups just innovate because that's who they are, right? And it might take them 10, 12 years. They might just be eating pot noodle every day for the first 5 years. But they're doing it because that's just who they are, that they're natural born, and they just don't believe in the status quo. So for me, I think it depends on who's financing it.
So one of the things that, Mike, you had on the slide was about, one of the pillars was about defense. How do you defend against around disruption? People think of disruption as always talk as a threat. Is disruption really a threat? And is not the case of a good defense is a strong offense? Is that not the case of that? Should we not be taking the metaphors from sport?
I think that's definitely true, because what the data shows is that no matter how industries try and build up defenses, they don't work. The point of innovative companies is that they're trying to find a way around them. So, your typical defenses would be IP or hiding behind regulations or whatever it may be. But many startups find a way to go around those. So it is about going on the offensive, not being worried about disruption, but trying to initiate it yourself. It's a big cliche, but that's what our clients, who are typically larger companies, need to do to defend themselves.
So one thing I'd like to ask all of you, and a chance for you to think about, is where is the next disruption coming from? Which, if you could pinpoint one country, and I pretty much know Jean-David is going to say someplace in Europe, that's okay. If there is some place, where is the next disruption? How will it occur? When will it occur? And who do you think is going to be that trigger? Is it going to be an SME? Is it going to be a startup? Is it going to be an individual with brilliance? Is it going to be a cluster? Is it going to be government? Is there something, an area that sticks out that says, actually, this is the place to watch, regardless of whether they're a EUREKA participant or not? Is there anyone? Anyone want to go first?
Well, I could easily say Canada.
Explain it. Justify.
As you know, Alberta.
Convince us. Why Canada?
Well, let me say a couple of things before I do that and come back to this, the question you asked about manufacturing and tying both skills and purpose together. I think one of the biggest skill sets that we lack is a skill set around business strategy and around business management. I've got a great job, so I get to visit a lot of startups. And a couple of weeks ago, I was in a startup. Walked in. There was a cauldron with a ping pong ball suspended in midair. It's held up by low frequency sound waves, and the application is to shoot lasers through a material and pull off thread of material from this. And I asked the CEO of the company to, how do you describe your business? And he said, well, it's simple. I offer my customer a solution that my customer can manage and my customer can afford. And I thought, what a great, didn't say a thing about the technology, but what a great way to describe a business. And I think what we're seeing right now, what I'm seeing, are the difficulties of actually applying technology. And in fact, a lot of startups come at this from a perspective. I have a technology. I'm offering a solution, but you're not offering a solution. You're offering a part of a solution, and it has to be. If you want to provide a customer, a client, a consumer with a solution, then you have to look at ways of integrating that. I think there are some real challenges there. But where the next disruption is coming from, I'd be down with you, Mike, in the Caribbean.
So you got one vote for Canada.
I won't say region, but I will say in twofold. The first one is I think it'll be in the area of energy and climate change. And I think it'll come from our kids, personally. I think I'm personally blown away by what Greta said, when she came to visit the UK. I think it's that generation that really will be the interesting thinkers. And I don't have any reason to say it beyond gut, because it's such an issue that is pressing to every single one of us around the globe. And I do feel our younger, freer thinkers will be the ones that really will be the ones to lead this evolution. And then secondly, I was just recently in Kenya judging an entrepreneurship competition funded by the UK government. So it was a bit of a mini Dragon's Den. And what I thought was amazing there was actually the disruption innovation that was coming from plastic recycling. So for example, Kenya's outlawed single-use plastics, and they told us on the plane, leave your bags on the plane, plastic bags, because it's illegal and you'll get fined. But the entrepreneurs from the ground up, frugal, bottom-up innovation We're thinking about how do we employ people to separate all the various recyclables, and how do we build plastic recycling plants so that we can remanufacture it. And to me, that bottom frugal up in the emerging market it just blew my mind. So I think it's those two for me.
Louise, any ideas?
Climate change, I'd probably agree on that one, but to pick a different point, I think it's going to be whoever can understand and to develop the best insights from the data that's available. So there's only ever going to be more data, and I think increasingly the ownership of that is going to sit with the individuals. So it's whoever can provide the most value back to an individual and have them share their data.
Which may end up being a Google or a Facebook, nice.
Maybe. I mean, current climate, not sure, but it's going to be whoever can take the best advantage of that data and give the value back to the consumer that owns it.
Jean-David, any thoughts?
Very difficult, of course. I would tend to agree with what Bindi said regarding the area and in particular the role of the next generation. I mean, having also a child myself, I can see that they have a different vision of the societies than the one that I have or my parents had. But to say something different, I would say that very likely we will leave a real disruption in the interconnection between human and the machine in our daily life.
Yeah.
In a number of areas. So not in a particular area, but in a number of areas. I mean, starting with health. And very likely there, but also in information and so on. But starting with health, I see a lot of change in the health sector, but also with impact on insurance sector and so on, because of the disruptive technologies that are coming in. And of course, it will be financed by the European Innovation Council.
Of course, of course. Finally, Mike, with the data, where do you see, where does it point to? If that report was a prediction, and you were to base your investment on that, what would you do?
Well, I mean, I was going to say what Binny said and pick the energy sector because it's actually the sector that I used to work in. But a different way of framing that would be, I think the source of the funding will be government ultimately, because climate change is such an intractable issue. The technology that sits behind solving it is so difficult that you cannot get the kind of short-term or even mid-term return that investment companies are looking for. It has to come from government, and it has to be long-term investment.
Fantastic. Well, folks, that is the end of our panel session. I hope that we have provided you with some insight. I know I've enjoyed speaking with my colleagues here, and it's been a lot of fun indeed. So please, if you wouldn't mind joining me in a round of applause for my guests. And finally, back to Charlotte. Thank you very much.